Before we begin, wherever you are tonight, however the day has treated you, settle in. Light is low, and this story will ask something of you. It will ask you to watch a woman walk through fire and come out carrying the flame. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from. Now, let us begin. In England in the year 1815, a daughter of the aristocracy was, in the precise language of the law, a dependent. She could not own property in her own name. She could not enter a contract. She could not appear in court as an independent party. Under the doctrine of coverture, a legal principle inherited from Norman feudal law, and still fully operational in the early 19th century, a woman's legal identity was absorbed entirely into that of her father, until marriage, at which point it transferred to her husband. She was not, in the eyes of English common law, a person. She was a vessel for property, a mechanism for alliance, a means by which one powerful family might bind itself to another. This is not a dramatic exaggeration. This is the law as it was written. The Married Women's Property Act, which would finally recognize a wife's right to own property independently, would not pass until 1870. The women who lived before it had no recourse. They had only composure, and they had whatever private strength they had managed to build in secret, in the hours when no one was watching. The letter arrived on a Wednesday in late October, when the leaves on the Ashfield estate had gone the color of dried blood, and the sky over Hertfordshire was the particular grey of something that has not yet decided whether to rain. Cecilia Ashfield found it on the breakfast table, which was already unusual. Letters addressed to her were rare. Letters addressed to her, and left unsealed, left open, as though the contents were of no consequence to conceal, were unprecedented. She was 24 years old, which in the social mathematics of Regency England made her something between a concern and a failure. Her two younger sisters had married the previous season. Her mother mentioned this with the frequency and precision of a woman who has identified a problem and intends to ensure everyone in proximity is equally aware of it. Her father mentioned it not at all, which was, Cecilia had long since determined, considerably more worrying. She poured her tea first. She had learned, in 24 years of managing this family's particular variety of chaos, that whatever the letter contained would require a clear head and a settled stomach. Then she picked it up and read it. It was not long. Her father was not a man who wasted words when gestures would suffice. It said, in the precise, slanted hand she had known all her life. The matter of your arrangement has been settled. Lord Pemberton will call on Thursday. You will receive him. You will receive him well. This is not a discussion. Cecilia set the letter down. She picked up her tea. She drank it slowly, looking at the window, at the dying leaves beyond the glass, at the gray sky above them. Then she set the cup down very carefully, went upstairs to her room, closed the door, and sat on the edge of her bed, with her hands folded in her lap. Lord Pemberton. She knew the name. Everyone in Hertfordshire knew the name, in the way that one knows the location of a particularly treacherous bend in the road not from personal experience, but from the accumulated accounts of those who had not navigated it successfully. Lord Pemberton was 53 years old. He had buried two wives, both young, both as the drawing rooms phrased it with careful vagueness of delicate constitution. He had 3 grown sons, who were known to be deeply opposed to any stepmother who might produce additional heirs. He had an estate in Shropshire that was reported to be prosperous, and a temperament that was reported to be the opposite. He had, apparently, made an arrangement with her father. Cecilia sat on the edge of her bed and thought about this for exactly 7 minutes. She knew it was 7 minutes, because she could see the clock on the mantel, and she had always been, to the quiet exasperation of everyone around her, very precise about time. Then she stood up, put on her walking coat, and went to find her father. Sir Rowland Ashfield was a man built on the architecture of debt, not the dramatic, catastrophic debt of the scandalous, not the kind that appeared in the newspapers or resulted in the seizure of family silver. His was the quieter, more persistent variety, the debt of a man who had lived 20 years beyond his means with sufficient skill that the consequences had not yet become visible to his neighbors, but they were becoming visible to his creditors. Cecilia knew this because she had managed the household accounts since she was 19, When it became clear that her mother had no aptitude for numbers, and her father had no inclination to face them, she knew exactly how much Ashfield owed, to whom, and at what rate of interest. She knew which creditors were patient, and which were not. She knew had known for 2 years, and had managed the knowledge with the same quiet precision she brought to everything that the estate was, perhaps 3 years. From a crisis, it could not quietly manage its way through. She also knew, now, what her father's solution was. She found him in the study, which smelled of pipe smoke and old leather, and the particular staleness of a room whose windows are never opened. He was standing at the desk rather than sitting, which meant he had been expecting her. Sir Rowland Ashfield was 61 and looked 70. He had once been a handsome man. Cecilia could see traces of it in the architecture of his face, but the years had not been kind, and neither had his habits. He looked at her when she entered with the expression of a man who has made a decision he intends to stand by regardless of the cost. "You read the letter," he said. "You left it open," she replied. "I assume that was intentional." He said nothing. This was confirmation. "Lord Pemberton," she said. She kept her voice entirely level. She was very good at this. She had been practicing since she was a child. "Tell me the terms." He looked at her for a moment, a look that might, in a different man, have been shame. In her father it was something more complicated, a recognition of what he was doing, a decision to do it anyway, and an unwillingness to dress it in anything cleaner than what it was. "His offer settles the primary debt," he said, "the Whitmore account and the Henderson note. Between them, that is £8,000. Cecilia's expression did not change. She had known about the Whitmore account. She had not known about the Henderson note. £8,000. She filed this information away with the same careful efficiency she brought to everything and said, "And in exchange, he requires a wife. He has specified certain requirements. Age, disposition. He has reviewed the available candidates in the county." A pause. "He has selected you." "Selected," she said, "as one selects a horse at auction." "Cecilia, I am not criticizing the metaphor, father. I am observing its accuracy. The practice of daughters being offered in settlement of a father's debts was not codified in law, but was entirely common in practice during the Regency period. A daughter's marriage represented a transfer of her person and any property she might inherit from one man's control to another's. Fathers who offered daughters as part of debt negotiations were not acting outside the law. There was no law against it. The daughter had no legal standing to refuse if her father had authority over her, and until marriage, he did. This is not fiction. This is documented history. She stood in the study for a moment longer, looking at her father across the desk. Across the years of accounts she had managed, and crises she had quietly contained, and compromises she had made with the reality of what this family was. "You should know," she said, "that Lord Pemberton's second wife died of a fever that a physician might have treated had one been summoned promptly. The physician was summoned 3 days after the fever began. I have read the coroner's report. It is a matter of public record." Her father said nothing. "I will receive him on Thursday," she said, "as you have asked." A pause. "I did not say I would accept him." She turned and left the study, and she did not permit herself to shake until she was in the corridor with the door closed behind her and no one to observe it. He arrived, as it happened, on Wednesday evening, not Lord Pemberton, but the other one. William Ashford, Duke of Wycliffe, had not been expected. He was not the sort of man who announced himself in advance, which his secretary found maddening and his enemies found alarming. He arrived at Ashfield House in a carriage that bore no crest. He had a habit of traveling without one when he did not wish to announce himself, and presented himself at the door with a card that said only his name and title, no flourish, no ornamentation. Cecilia, descending the staircase as the butler admitted him, received her first impression of the Duke of Wycliffe from the landing above. A tall man, very still, in a dark coat and traveling clothes that were expensive, in the way of things that do not require display. He was perhaps 36 or 37. He had the kind of face that was not immediately legible, composed, precise, giving nothing away by default. He handed his card to the butler without looking at it, because men who have handed cards to butlers for 20 years do not need to look at what they already know is there. He looked up. He saw her on the landing. Their eyes met for a moment. His were a dark, unreadable gray, and then he looked back at the butler with an entirely unchanged expression. "I believe Sir Roland is expecting me," he said. His voice was low and carried the trace of something northern in it, a slight sharpening of certain consonants that the southern aristocracy would call regional and Cecilia called honest. Sir Roland was, in fact, not expecting him. But Sir Roland, when informed of who was standing in his entrance hall, appeared in the study doorway with a velocity that Cecilia had not witnessed her father achieve in some years. She descended the remainder of the stairs at her usual pace and watched the Duke of Wycliffe enter the study, and she stood in the entrance hall for a moment after the door closed, and she thought about the way he had looked up at her from the landing. It was not the look she was accustomed to receiving from men. It was not the quick assessment pretty enough, past her first season, probably desperate that she had navigated for years. It was the look of a man who has seen something and has immediately begun, quietly, to consider it. She went back upstairs. She had letters to write. She had always had letters to write. Inside the study, the Duke of Wycliffe accepted a chair he had not been offered, declined the brandy he was offered, and said to Sir Roland Ashfield, with the direct economy of a man who does not enjoy preamble, "I understand you have reached an arrangement with Lord Pemberton." Sir Roland, who had been attempting to manage the surprise of this visit into something resembling controlled hospitality, stopped. "That is the matter is not yet. Is it concluded or is it not?" A pause. "Not yet concluded," Sir Roland admitted. "Good," said the Duke. "Then we have something to discuss." The Duke of Wycliffe's unexpected appearance reflects a mechanism common to Regency-era aristocratic society: the overlap between business, debt, and social obligation. Great dukes and earls were not merely social figures. They were financial powers. They held notes, owned mortgages, and sat on boards of the banks and investment houses that controlled much of England's capital. A duke arriving to discuss a man's debt arrangements was not merely a social call. It was a wielding of structural power, and both parties in such a meeting knew it precisely. William Ashford had known about the Ashfield debt for 14 months. He had not sought out this knowledge. It had come to him through the ordinary channels by which a man of his position received information. A banker's confidence here, a solicitor's disclosure there. The quiet accumulation of the kind of detail that moves through certain circles, like water through limestone, invisibly, thoroughly, and always downward. He had also known about Lord Pemberton's interest in Miss Ashfield for approximately 6 weeks. This had come to him through a different channel. His cousin, Lady Hertford, who moved through Hertfordshire society with the information-gathering efficiency of a woman who considers gossip a civic duty. Lady Hertford had mentioned, in the course of a single letter that also contained observations about the weather, a recipe for medicinal tincture, and the state of the roads, north of St. Albans, that poor Cecilia Ashfield was to be offered to that dreadful Pemberton man in settlement of Roland's debts, and that it was a crying shame, because the girl was the only intelligent one in the family, and was being sacrificed for her father's foolishness. And William really ought to do something about it, since he controlled the Henderson note anyway, and could simply— He had stopped reading at the Henderson note. He had looked up from the letter in the library of Wycliffe House in Mayfair, where he spent most of his time when in London, and he had sat with this information for a long time. He had purchased the Henderson note 8 months ago as part of a routine consolidation of smaller debt instruments. He had not known, at the time, that it was connected to the Ashfield estate. He had certainly not known that it would become, in Sir Roland's calculations, part of the price of his daughter. William Ashford was a man who had spent 15 years building a reputation for cold, precise, uninvolved efficiency. He did not intervene in other families' arrangements. He did not involve himself in social complications that were not his concern. He was known, in the particular way of powerful men who choose carefully, for doing very little publicly and a great deal privately. He was not, despite the reputation, a cold man. He was a controlled one, which is a different thing entirely, and one that the people who called him cold were generally not sophisticated enough to perceive the difference. He had been engaged once, at 26, to a woman who had then married someone else. He had not spoken of it since, because he saw no purpose in speaking of things that could not be altered, but it had arranged certain things in him in a particular order that had not changed in the decade since. He sat in the library for 20 minutes. Then he called for his carriage. Now, in Sir Rowland's study, he looked at the older man across the desk and said, "I hold the Henderson note." Sir Rowland went quite still. "I also have some familiarity," William continued, "with the Whitmore account, through a business associate. The combined liability is, I believe, the basis of your arrangement with Lord Pemberton." Yes," Sir Rowland said. He was a man who had managed difficult conversations for decades, but he was discovering that the Duke of Wycliffe conducted them at a pace and a precision that left very little room for the usual maneuvering. The settlement would. "I am not interested in the settlement," William said. "I am interested in withdrawing the Henderson note from the arrangement entirely." Silence. "I will retire the note," William said. "In full. The debt is discharged. The Whitmore account is a separate matter, and I will not speak for it. But the Henderson note, which represents, I believe, the larger portion of the sum, will no longer exist as a liability against this estate, as of tomorrow morning." Sir Rowland stared at him. "Your Grace, why?" William looked at the desk for a moment. He was precise about this next part, because it needed to be understood correctly. "Because," he said carefully, "a debt should not purchase a person. And because I find Lord Pemberton's interest in your daughter to be inadvisable." He paused. "For her." Sir Rowland was silent for a long moment. Then, slowly, his expression shifted into something that was not quite gratitude and not quite relief, but was somewhere in the complicated territory between them. "She will still need to marry," he said. "The Whitmore account remains." "I am aware," William said. He stood. "That is a separate conversation, one that I suggest you conduct with your daughter before you conduct it with anyone else." He took his hat from the chair beside him. "She is, I suspect, considerably more informed about the state of your finances than you believe." He left the study. In the entrance hall, the butler was already at the door. William paused at the foot of the staircase for a moment, looking up at the landing where he had seen her, that still, composed figure in dark blue, looking down at him with eyes that were taking accurate measure and offering nothing in return. He went out to his carriage. He did not look back. Cecilia learned what had happened from her father that evening at dinner, delivered in the stilted, evasive manner Sir Rowland employed when conveying information he suspected would not be received as intended. "The Duke of Wycliffe has retired the Henderson note," he said, between the soup and the fish, as a gesture of goodwill. Cecilia set down her spoon. "The Henderson note," she said. "The note I did not know existed until this morning." Her father had the grace to look at the tablecloth. "What does he want in exchange?" she asked. Nothing. He said nothing of exchange. She looked at her father for a long moment. "Men like the Duke of Wycliffe do not retire debts of £4,000 as gestures of goodwill," she said. "What did he say?" Sir Rowland repeated the conversation as faithfully as a man can repeat something he only partially understood. He omitted, as men often do, the parts that reflected poorly on himself. But he included, because he could not quite manage to omit it, the Duke's final observation, that she was more informed about the state of the finances than her father believed. Cecilia sat with this for a moment. Then she said, very quietly, "He knew about Lord Pemberton. He mentioned, he knew. And he came to remove the mechanism that made Pemberton's offer viable." She looked at the candles, at the steady flame of them in the draught from the window. "That is not a gesture of goodwill. That is an intervention." She went to bed that night with the careful, orderly part of her mind already arranging what she knew into columns and rows. The debt structure, the Duke's action, the question of his motive, the unresolved Whitmore account, the unanswered question of Thursday. And behind all of it, persistent and inconvenient, the image of gray eyes looking up at her from an entrance hall, taking measure. She woke very early and wrote a letter. She addressed it to the Duke of Wycliffe at his London address, which she knew because she had looked it up in Depicts with the same focused efficiency she brought to any research task. The letter said, Your Grace, I understand you have intervened in my father's financial arrangements on grounds that concern, in part, my welfare. I would be grateful if you would explain why, in terms that do not require me to speculate. I find speculation inefficient. Cecilia Ashfield. She sealed it and sent it before she had time to reconsider. She received his reply the following morning. He had apparently been in Hertfordshire, still, at the County Inn, and it was brief enough that she read it standing in the entrance hall before she had even removed her gloves from the morning's walk. It said, Miss Ashfield, because Pemberton's record is not something a man of conscience can observe being repeated upon an unwilling party, and because the instrument that made you a transaction, rather than a person, happened to be in my possession, the Whitmore account is not mine to retire. I suggest you address it directly. You appear to be the appropriate person for the task. W.A. Lord Pemberton arrived on Thursday at 2 o'clock, precisely as her father had indicated, in a carriage that was designed to communicate prosperity, and communicated instead a prosperity that was working very hard to be noticed. Cecilia received him in the drawing room. She had chosen her dress carefully, not her best, because her best would suggest she was trying to impress, and she was not trying to impress Lord Pemberton. The dark green wool, respectable, contained, and the color, she had always privately noted, that people wore when they wanted to be taken seriously. Lord Pemberton was exactly as she had constructed him from the accounts she had assembled over 2 careful days of inquiry. He was 53, and looked it. He had a florid complexion, and the bearing of a man who had been told he was imposing for so long that he had come to find it a personal achievement. He looked at Cecilia with the assessing attention of a man evaluating a purchase, and he did not trouble himself to conceal this, because concealing things from women was not something he had ever found necessary. Historical context. The formal call made by a prospective suitor to a young woman's family was a ritualized social performance in Regency England. It followed precise protocols. The man presented himself, met the family, was left briefly alone with the prospective bride, in a supervised setting, and the exchange was understood by all parties to be a negotiation dressed in the clothing of courtship. Women who opposed these arrangements had almost no legal recourse. Their only weapons were composure, strategic delay, and for those brave or desperate enough to use it, the direct refusal that could shame a family into retreat or enrage them into pressure. Miss Ashfield, he said, when the introductions were complete, and her mother had tactfully withdrawn to the far corner of the room with her embroidery. I believe we understand each other's situation. I believe we have been told each other's situation, she replied pleasantly. Whether we understand it may be a different matter. He smiled. It did not reach his eyes. Your father has spoken well of you. I imagine he has spoken practically of me, she said. My father is a practical man when it suits him. A flicker. Lord Pemberton was not accustomed to young women who returned his volleys. He adjusted. I have a comfortable estate, he said. My sons are established. A wife would find Pemberton Hall well appointed. I am sure she would, Cecilia said. I have made some inquiries about Pemberton Hall. She folded her hands in her lap. I have also made some inquiries about the 2 women who preceded me in the role you are proposing. The room was very quiet. Her mother had stopped embroidering. Lord Pemberton's florid complexion deepened by a shade. That is, those were private matters. Lady Pemberton the First died in childbirth, which is common and tragic, and speaks to nothing except the cruelty of nature. Lady Pemberton the Second, Cecilia continued, in the same level, pleasant tone, died of a fever in February of 1812. The physician's records, which are accessible to anyone who takes the trouble to inquire, indicate that she was ill for 4 days before a physician was summoned. The physician noted in his report that earlier treatment might have altered the outcome. She looked at Lord Pemberton directly. I have read the report. It is 11 pages. I read all of them. The silence was now of a different quality entirely. I am not suggesting impropriety, Cecilia said carefully. I am suggesting that I am a woman who reads 11-page physicians' reports before making significant decisions about her future. I wanted you to know that, so that we understand each other accurately. She stood. I appreciate your call, Lord Pemberton. I do not think we should waste any more of your Thursday. Lord Pemberton stood. He looked at her with an expression that moved through surprise, then anger, then something that was almost not quite, but almost a kind of grudging recognition. He left without another word. Cecilia sat back down in the drawing room after she heard the carriage leave, and she breathed once, slowly, and her mother put down her embroidery and looked at her with an expression that was equal parts admiration and terror. "Your father," her mother said carefully, "is going to be very upset." "Yes," Cecilia agreed. "He is." She was not wrong. Sir Rowland's response to the news of Lord Pemberton's departure was, in its broad structure, what Cecilia had anticipated. The specifics were, as always with her father's rages, somewhat beyond prediction. He found her in the library. She had retreated there deliberately, because the library was the one room in the house where she felt the ground was solid, and he came in with the contained velocity of a man who has been furious since approximately the moment the carriage wheels left the drive, and has been moving steadily toward the nearest available target since. "You dismissed him," he said. "I did." She agreed. After everything, he stopped. He looked at her across the room, and she could see in his face the full weight of what this was. The debt, the calculation, the years of managed crisis, and now this new rupture in what he had assembled as its solution. "Cecilia, do you understand what you have done?" "I understand exactly what I have done," she said. "I have declined to marry a man who has a documented record of negligence toward his wives. I have declined to make myself a transaction in settlement of a debt I did not create." She met his eyes. "I did not create this debt, Father. I have managed this household's accounts for 5 years. I have found savings he did not find. I have delayed creditors he did not know were impatient. I have done everything within my power to protect this family from the consequences of choices I did not make." Her voice was still level. She was very careful about keeping it level. "I will not pay for them with my person." Sir Rowland stood in the library doorway, and something in him shifted. Cecilia could see it. Something that was not quite collapse but was adjacent to it. The particular subsidence of a man who has been arguing with a wall, and has suddenly understood that the wall is load-bearing. "The Whitmore account," he said. His voice was quieter now. Pemberton was prepared to absorb it. "The Whitmore account is £1,200, Cecilia said. "I know, because I have looked at every account in this household that I can access, and I have been looking for 2 years. She paused. "I have a plan for the Whitmore account that does not involve Lord Pemberton or any other man purchasing me. I would like to present it to you, if you are willing to sit down and listen." He stared at her. Then, slowly, he sat down. Women like Cecilia, who took an active role in household financial management, were not unknown in Regency England, though they were rarely acknowledged. The period saw a growing, if contested, conversation about women's intellect and capacity for public life. Mary Wollstonecraft's A Vindication of the Rights of Woman had been published in 1792, and its arguments continued to circulate among educated women throughout the early 19th century. Women managing accounts, educating themselves in law and finance, and navigating the financial machinery of their households with competence was common practice, disguised as domestic management. The tools were never officially theirs. They used them anyway. She presented the plan for the Whitmore account over the next 40 minutes, from the notes she had already prepared. It involved the sale of 2 parcels of farmland that were underperforming, a renegotiation of the terms with Mr. Whitmore himself, who was, she had established, through inquiry, a reasonable man under financial pressure of his own, who might welcome a structured settlement over a protracted legal dispute, and a modest reduction in household expenditure that her father would find uncomfortable, but survivable. When she finished, the library was quiet. Sir Rowland looked at his daughter across the desk. He looked at her for a long time. "You have been carrying this," he said. "Yes," she said. "For how long?" 5 years. He looked at his hands. He looked like a man who is arriving, somewhat late, at an understanding of something he should have understood considerably earlier, and is not entirely sure what to do with the arrival. "The Duke of Wycliffe," he said finally. "When he told me to speak with you, he knew. He appears," Cecilia said carefully, "to be observant." Her father looked at her. "He is coming to dinner on Saturday," he said. She looked up. He is? I invited him, before you came downstairs on Wednesday." A pause. I thought it might be useful to have him in the room. He seemed to register, for the first time, the full implication of what he was saying. "I did not tell you." "No," Cecilia said. "You did not." A silence of some complexity settled over the library. "I will be at dinner on Saturday," she said eventually. "As I am, at every dinner." She left the library and went upstairs and stood at the window of her room for a long time, looking out at the garden where the last of the autumn leaves were giving way to bare branches. And she thought about gray eyes and brief letters, and the particular quality of a man who says, "I suggest you address it directly," because he has already perceived that she is the appropriate person for the task. The Duke of Wycliffe arrived at 7, alone, which was itself a statement. A man of his position dining at a country house of middling consequence would ordinarily bring a secretary, a valet, some component of the social machinery that communicated importance. He brought himself, and the dark coat, and the same quality of attention she had observed from the landing, that careful, unhurried notice of everything in the room. He sat across from her at dinner, which arrangement her mother had managed with the transparent subtlety of a woman who has decided something and intends to engineer it while appearing to be simply distributing place cards. "Stay with us. The dining table is where everything begins to shift. Pull your blanket up if you need to. This is the part you will want to remember." The conversation at dinner was general, the state of the roads, the harvest, the latest news from the continent, where Napoleon's shadow still fell across the political imagination of England even in defeat. William Ashford contributed to it with the economic precision of a man who says exactly as much as is useful and no more, a quality Cecilia found simultaneously relieving and, she privately admitted, somewhat provocative. She was accustomed to filling conversational silences. He did not leave silences that required filling. After the main course, when her parents were engaged with the older aunt, who had come to stay and must be managed at meals like a weather system, William Ashford said, in the quiet tone of a man who has been waiting for a private moment and has identified one, "Your father tells me Lord Pemberton's visit was brief." "It was the appropriate length," Cecilia said. "What did you say to him?" She looked across the table. "I told him I had read the physician's report on his second wife." A pause. "All of it?" "It was 11 pages. Something happened at the corners of his eyes. Not quite a smile, he was not a man who smiled easily. She had determined. But the indication of one, the ghost of an expression that confirmed, somehow, everything she had suspected about what was underneath the controlled surface. "He will not be offering for you again," William said. "No, he will not." She looked at her water glass. "You knew about the report. I made inquiries. Before you came here." "Yes." She looked at him directly. "Why?" He met her eyes without deflection. "I told you why in my letter. You told me the mechanism, the Henderson note. A man of conscience." She kept her voice very level. "Those are reasons of principle. I am asking if there was a reason of specificity." The table was quiet around them for a moment. Her mother was successfully managing the aunt. Her father was studiously interested in his wine. William Ashford looked at her across the dinner table with the same steady, undeflecting attention he had given everything since he walked through the door, and he said, "Lady Hertford is my cousin. She writes to me in considerable detail, and she wrote about me. She wrote that you were intelligent, composed, and being offered to a dangerous man in settlement of a debt you didn't create." A pause. "She said you were the only sensible one in the family and it would be a waste of a remarkable mind." He picked up his wine glass with the deliberate calm of a man who is saying more than his words contain. I agreed with her assessment. Cecilia looked at him for a moment. "You agreed," she said, "based on your cousin's letter, before you had met me." "I confirmed it," he said, "when you came down the stairs." The aunt said something loud on the other side of the table, and everyone turned, and the moment closed over itself like water over a stone, and Cecilia looked at her plate and breathed once, carefully, and decided that she was going to need to think about this considerably before she said anything else. He came back on Sunday morning, which she had not anticipated but, on reflection, was entirely consistent with what she had begun to understand about how he operated. He did not wait. He decided, and then he moved with the quiet directness of a man who has very little patience for the protocol of delay when the substance of a thing is clear. She was in the garden when he arrived, the part of the garden she had taken over in the past 3 years as her own domain, which her mother found eccentric and her sisters had found inexplicable, where she grew things that were useful rather than merely ornamental. She was in her working coat and her old gloves, and she was doing something unglamorous with the last of the autumn planting. And she looked up to find him at the garden gate, without the slightest indication that either of them was going to pretend this was a conventional social call. "Miss Ashfield," he said. "Your Grace," she said. She did not pretend to be surprised. She pulled off her right glove and gestured at the garden with the general air of a woman who has decided not to apologize for being found exactly where she belongs. "I am planting garlic." "I see that." He looked at the garden. Really looked, with that same steady attention. "Practical, practical," she agreed. He opened the gate and came in, which she had not invited but also had not dissuaded, and he stood with his hands in his coat pockets looking at the beds she had laid out with their autumn companions, the kale, the late chard, the bulbs that would not show until spring, and he said nothing for a moment, in a way that was not awkward, but was simply him being genuinely interested in what he was looking at. Kitchen gardens, or physic gardens, maintained by women of the gentry, were common throughout the 18th and early 19th centuries. Many educated women of this period maintained a practical knowledge of medicinal and culinary plants as an extension of their domestic management role. This was one of the few domains in which women could exercise genuine expertise that was publicly acknowledged, since it fell within the accepted sphere of household management. Women like Cecilia, who understood plants, accounts, and household medicine, were not unusual. They were simply rarely given credit for it. "I received a letter this morning," she said, returning to the garlic. She found it easier to have difficult conversations while doing something with her hands. She had always been this way. "From Mr. Whitmore." "Oh?" "He has agreed to the structured settlement. 12 installments over 2 years, with a modest reduction in the total sum in exchange for the certainty of regular payment." She pressed a bulb into the soil. "The Whitmore account will be resolved without the sale of my person or either of the 2 proposed farmland parcels. I found a third parcel, smaller, less productive, that will cover the first 3 installments and preserve the agricultural income on the better land." A silence. "How long did that take you to arrange?" he asked. The initial letter took 2 days. His response came faster than I expected. He is a reasonable man. He wants the money. He does not particularly want the disruption of a legal proceeding." She looked up. "Most people, in my experience, want resolution. They only become unreasonable when they believe resolution is unavailable." William Ashford looked at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize. The look of a man who is expected to be impressed and has been exceeded. "The debt is solved," he said. "The debt is solved. Without Lord Pemberton. Without anyone I did not choose." She pulled off the other glove and stood, brushing soil from her coat. She looked at him directly, because she had decided, somewhere in the night between Saturday dinner and Sunday morning, that she was going to look at this directly and without management. "You came back." "Yes." "Why?" He looked at the garden for a moment. "Because I have been engaged in other people's financial arrangements for 15 years, he said, "and this is the first time I have encountered one where the person most affected by the arrangement had also most thoroughly solved it." He looked at her. "I wanted to say so. You rode from the county inn to say so, among other things." She looked at him. He looked at her. The garden was very quiet around them, and the morning was cold and gray, and entirely ordinary, and none of it, not the cold, not the gray, not the ordinariness, diminished anything. "Ask me," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then, "Miss Ashfield Cecilia, I would like to call on you, formally, with your father's knowledge and your own consent, which I have come to believe is considerably more important." A pause. "I am not offering to solve anything. You appear to have solved everything yourself. I am asking if you would be willing to consider." "Consider," she said. "Me," he said. At whatever pace you require. She looked at the garden. She looked at the garlic beds and the kale, and the bare branches of the fruit trees beyond the wall, and the gray October sky above all of it. And she thought about the Henderson note, and the letter she had sent, and the 11-page physician's report, and the Thursday she had stood across from Lord Pemberton, and made herself not shake. She thought about gray eyes on a landing, and a note that said, "You appear to be the appropriate person for the task. You may call on me," she said. On Friday. Friday, he agreed. He left the garden with the same direct quiet with which he had entered it. And she watched him go. And then she put her gloves back on and went back to the garlic. And she planted the remainder of the bed with the steady, patient attention of a woman who has learned that the things worth having are always the things planted in the knowledge that spring is coming, even when you cannot yet see it. The public exposure of a man's character in Regency society was one of the few available mechanisms of social accountability. Courts were slow, expensive, and largely inaccessible to women. But society, the interlocking network of drawing rooms, dinner tables, assemblies, and country houses that constituted the world of the English aristocracy, moved quickly on information, and a man whose reputation was publicly damaged by someone with social authority sufficient to make the damage stick could find himself excluded from the very networks that constituted his power. This was not justice, but it was the closest available approximation of it, and women who wielded it did so with full understanding of its limitations and its costs. The Pemberton dinner at the Hertford estate, Lady Hertford's annual county assembly, which everyone of consequence attended, because Lady Hertford made non-attendance feel like a personal affront, came 3 weeks later, on a Friday evening in November. Cecilia had not anticipated that Lord Pemberton would attend. He did. She had not anticipated that he would find her in the yellow drawing room before the second set and say, in the particular tone of a man who has identified what he believes to be the opportunity for a private correction, "Miss Ashfield, I believe you made certain implications during your father's call. Implications that, if they were to circulate more widely, might reflect on my reputation." Cecilia looked at him steadily. "I made no implications," she said. "I cited documented records that are open to interpretation." "Physicians' reports are not open to interpretation," she said. "They are documents of fact." She paused. "I have not shared those documents with anyone, Lord Pemberton. I had no cause to." She looked at him. "I trust that remains the case." He looked at her for a moment, and then he looked past her, at something over her left shoulder, and his expression changed in a way that was not exactly fear, but was in its vicinity. She turned. William Ashford was standing approximately 4 feet behind her. He was holding 2 glasses of champagne and wearing the expression he always wore in public, which was to say he was wearing no expression at all. But he had been there, she did not know for how long, but he had been there, and Lord Pemberton had seen him and had done the arithmetic. The arithmetic was simple. The Duke of Wycliffe was calling on Miss Ashfield. The Duke of Wycliffe was one of the 10 most powerful men in England. Lord Pemberton was a man with a fragile reputation and 2 dead wives and a great deal to lose. "Lord Pemberton," William said pleasantly, "I believe your host is looking for you. Lady Hertford wished to seat the first dinner. She mentioned your name specifically." Lady Hertford had not mentioned Lord Pemberton's name specifically. But Lord Pemberton did not know this, and he did not call the Duke of Wycliffe's accuracy into question in a public room, and so he made his excuses and departed with a speed that was undignified and effective. Cecilia turned back to William. He offered her one of the champagne glasses. "You did not need to do that," she said. "I was standing there," he said. "You were standing there deliberately." He considered this. "I saw him approach you and recognized his bearing. The bearing of a man who has decided to attempt to manage something privately that is better left unmanaged." He paused. "I thought I would be available, in case you needed someone to be available." She looked at the champagne glass for a moment. "And if I had not needed you, then I would have drunk both of these," he said, and said nothing. "You are entirely capable of managing Lord Pemberton." She looked at him. He was not wrong. She was capable. She had been managing things considerably more difficult than Lord Pemberton for a long time. "Thank you," she said, "for being available. Always," he said. And the simplicity of it, not a flourish, not a performance, just the plain declaration of a man who means what he says was, she found, the most persuasive thing he had ever offered her. They drank champagne. They went in to dinner. And Lord Pemberton, across the table, was very quiet for the rest of the evening. The thing that changed, in the end, came not from the Duke, or from Lord Pemberton, or from the resolution of the debt. It came from a conversation with her father on a Wednesday morning in December, when the frost had come to Ashfield, and the garden was under its first hard cover, and the house was cold, in the way that old houses are cold, not fiercely, but thoroughly. As though the cold has been there so long, it has become structural. She found him in the library, which was where she always found him when he had something to say and had not yet found the words for it. He was sitting in the chair by the window rather than at the desk, which meant it was not a business conversation. It was the other kind. "I have been thinking," he said, without preamble, "about your mother." She sat down across from him and waited. "When I married her," he said, "she was 22. I was 30. The arrangement was it was not unlike what I proposed for you. Her family needed the connection. My family had the money. It was practical." He looked at the frost on the window. "I did not ask her what she thought of it." "No," Cecilia said. "I have been thinking," he said slowly, "that I have done to you what was done to her, without noticing that I was doing it, because it is what one does." He looked at her. "She told me once, your mother, that she had wanted to be a teacher. When she was young. She had very good Latin." "She does," Cecilia said. "She still does. She translates things in the evenings when she thinks no one is watching." Sir Rowland looked at his hands. He looked like a man who is understanding something that has been in front of him for 30 years, and he has simply, until this moment, not turned to face. "I am not a good man," he said. "I am not a bad one. I am an ordinary one. Which is perhaps worse, in some ways, because ordinary men do ordinary damage and call it the way of things." He looked at her directly. "You deserve better than the way of things." The library was very quiet. The frost was on the window, and the cold was in the walls, and the fire was low, and her father was looking at her with something in his face that she had not seen there before, or had not known how to name before. "Father," she said carefully, "if I were to accept the Duke of Wycliffe's interest, would you consent to terms that allow me to retain the management of my own finances, independently, under my husband's agreement? In writing." He looked at her. "Can that be arranged? A private marriage settlement can stipulate almost anything the parties agree upon. It is not common, but it is legal." She met his eyes. "He would agree to it. I believe he would agree to it." Sir Rowland looked at his daughter for a long moment. Then he said, "How do you know?" "Because," she said, "he has given me, in every interaction we have had, the clear impression that what he values in me is the same thing everyone else has attempted to take away from me." She looked at the window. "My capacity to think." Her father was quiet. "Consent to whatever terms she negotiates," he said finally. "That is what I will do." He looked at the fire. "It is the least I owe you. Private marriage settlements, legal agreements, negotiated before a wedding, that stipulated property rights, income, and financial management were available to wealthy families throughout the Regency period. For women whose fathers had the legal standing and the will to negotiate with them, a marriage settlement could provide significant protections: guaranteed income, retained property, protection for children's inheritance. They were not common, not accessible to women without means or advocates, and not enforced with any great enthusiasm by a legal system built on coverture. But they existed, and some women used them. William Ashford proposed to Cecilia Ashfield on a Friday afternoon in the library of Ashfield House, which was the room she had chosen for the conversation, because it was the room where she felt she could think clearly, and she had the strong sense correct, as it turned out that this was going to be a conversation that required thinking clearly. He had been calling on Fridays for 6 weeks. He had met her mother, who approved of him with the visible relief of a woman who has been worried for a long time. He had met her father, who was making, with some difficulty, the internal revisions that December had initiated. He had walked in the garden and sat in the drawing room, and spoken at length about agricultural reform, and at equal length about the Spanish campaign, and at considerably less length about himself, which she found interesting, and then found revealing, and then found entirely consistent. She poured the tea herself, as always, and offered it across the low table, and he accepted it as always with a brief gravity of acknowledgement that she had come to understand was his version of thank you. And she sat down, and there was a silence that was not empty, but was the particular fullness of something that has been building and has arrived at its conclusion. "I have prepared a draft," he said, "of the settlement terms." She looked at him. "I have as well," she said. They exchanged documents. They read in silence for several minutes. Cecilia read his draft with the focused attention she brought to every piece of paper that had ever crossed her hands, and she found, not quite with surprise, but with the satisfaction of a hypothesis confirmed, that it contained almost everything she had proposed in her own draft, plus 3 provisions she had not thought of, all of them in her favor. "You included a provision for independent financial management," she said. "I spoke with my solicitor. It can be structured through the settlement as a designated trust in your name. You would manage it entirely." He looked at her, "With reporting to me quarterly if you wish, for the pleasure of seeing how it performs." "I do not need oversight," she said. "I know," I said, "for my pleasure. I expect it would be instructive." She looked at the document again. "You have included Ashfield in the trust, as an asset to be managed as you see fit, not by me." He paused. "Your father has some years left, but the estate will need management. You know it better than anyone. It should remain yours to manage." Cecilia set the document down. She looked at the fire, at the steady, quiet heat of it, at the way the light moved. She had spent 24 years in this house, managing things with the certainty that the authority to manage them would always belong to someone else. She had done it anyway, because the alternative was to let things fall, and she was not built for watching things fall. She looked at William Ashford, who was sitting across from her with the same composure he always carried, but beneath it she could see it now. She had learned to see it, the particular tension of a man who is entirely certain of what he wants and is waiting, without performance, to learn if the certainty is mutual. "You should know," she said, "that I am not easy to live with. I am precise and opinionated, and I will argue with you when I believe you are wrong." "I would be disappointed otherwise," he said. "I keep unusual hours. I rise very early. I have been known to conduct correspondence at 2 in the morning when something is unresolved." "I keep unusual hours as well," he said. "We may overlap." She looked at him. "You are not going to attempt to manage me?" "No," he said simply. "I would not know where to begin." The fire crackled once. The frost was at the window, and the afternoon was dark and cold and entirely still. "Then yes," she said. He looked at her. "Yes, William," she said more clearly. "The answer is yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, with a care and sincerity that she recognized as his version of everything he did not know how to say in any other way, "Thank you." She looked at him. She felt, for the first time since the letter had arrived on the Wednesday morning of the dying leaves, the particular and unfamiliar sensation of solid ground. "You are welcome," she said. "Shall we go over the settlement terms paragraph by paragraph? There are 4 provisions I would like to revise." 3, he said. "I anticipated 3. 4, she said. He almost smiled. "Show me." She opened the document. He moved his chair around the table to sit beside her. Outside, the frost held its ground, and the afternoon darkened toward evening, and in the library at Ashfield House, 2 people who had both learned the same lesson in different ways, that patience is its own kind of power, and that the most important decisions are made not in the grand public gesture but in the quiet, specific accumulation of chosen trust, began to build something together. It was not romantic in any conventional sense. There was no moonlight. There was no declaration. There were margin notes and counterproposals, and a disagreement about the management of the eastern farmland that lasted 40 minutes and was resolved in her favor. It was, she thought, exactly right. They were married in January, in the church at Ashfield Village, in a ceremony that was small and entirely devoid of performance. The settlement had been signed 3 days prior, reviewed by 3 solicitors, certified by 2, and filed in chancery in a manner that was, as William had noted, entirely legal and entirely uncommon. The notice in the Morning Post was brief. Several people in Hertfordshire were surprised. Lady Hertford was not. Lord Pemberton attended a different assembly that season and did not speak of it. Sir Rowland Ashfield spent the following year in the slow, genuine process of understanding his wife, who was still very good at Latin and had been waiting quietly for 30 years for someone to notice. Cecilia arranged, through a conversation with her mother that she approached with the same careful deliberation she brought to everything, for Mrs. Ashfield to begin teaching at the village school 2 mornings a week. It was not what her mother had once imagined for herself. It was what was available. Her mother found, to her own quiet astonishment, that it was enough. Cecilia managed 3 estates within the first year of marriage. The trust performed at a rate that exceeded the quarterly projections by 11%. William read the reports with attention and without comment until the 3rd one, at which point he looked up from the document and said, with the expression she had come to know as his version of happiness, "I told you the provision was worth including." "You did," she agreed. "You were right. I have made a note of the date." He looked at her. "So, I can remember how often it happens," she said. And the Duke of Wycliffe, who was not a cold man but a controlled one, laughed genuinely, without management, the way people laugh when they are entirely at ease. And it was, Cecilia thought, listening to it, the best sound she had heard in a very long time. The Married Women's Property Act of 1870 was the first significant legal reform to challenge the doctrine of coverture in England. Before it, women like Cecilia existed, women who managed, strategized, negotiated, and built, but did so without legal recognition of their authority. The private marriage settlement was one of the few tools available to those with access to it. The vast majority of women had no such access. History remembers the heroines of dramatic stories. It rarely records the names of the women who ran the household accounts, read the physician's reports, planted the garlic, and kept everything standing by the force of their own quiet, unglamorous, essential competence. This story is for them. Thank you for listening. If this story moved, you leave a comment below and tell me where you were when you listened to it. Subscribe. Share it with someone who needs to hear a story about a woman who was offered as a transaction and refused to be one. We will see you next time.